People are coming from, and we know they come from prisons. We know they come from mental institutions, insane asylums. We know they're terrorists. Nobody has ever seen anything like we're witnessing right now. It is a very sad thing for our country. It's poisoning the blood of our country. It's so bad, and people are coming in with disease. People are coming in with every possible thing that you can have.
That was Donald Trump in an online video discussing, among other things, the immigration crisis in America. Welcome to today's video. I am your host, Eric Darnley Small. Donald Trump disparaging migrants is nothing new. He has previously talked about migrants being criminals. What is new is this concept of mass immigration poisoning the quote-unquote blood of our country. There were so many different directions we could have gone, that I could have gone in discussing what Donald Trump is saying here. It's so damaging and so despicable, in part because this is a former president, but also because it brings to fore this concept of quote unquote the blood of our nation. And when a racist talks about the blood of a people, what they're talking about is genetics. This is not the first time the 45th president has made comments on intelligence being linked to genetics. The former president and current frontrunner on the Republican Party ticket repeatedly told his cabinet and other experts that he knew more than they did about quote-unquote nuclear because his uncle was a professor at MIT. This is from the Washington Post back in March 2020. And it says, quote, "In the course of a visit at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention last week, Trump attempted to show his mastery of the coronavirus situation by evoking his uncle, a quote, super great genius, Dr. John Trump. I like this stuff. I really get it. People are surprised I understand it, maybe because I have a natural ability. It's not the first time Dr. Trump has come up. The president says he used to discuss nuclear with his uncle all the time. And in a rambling 2016 campaign speech, he referenced Dr. John Trump at MIT. Good genes, okay? Very smart. Intelligence as an attribute that is inheritable from your parents, grandparents, uncles, etc. Meritocracy and IQ fetishism on the tech right is what my video is about today. To that end, I want to bring to attention an article in the video from about 2 weeks ago. I've already posted a link to the article on my Mastodon page, Mastodon me, that's mastodon.vtip.me/@Eric. I want to show some clips from that video, and you can find it on the new Statesmen's YouTube channel, where the writer Quinn Slobodian, I think I have that right, goes into detail about what is happening on the right as it pertains to intelligence and IQ. It's quite shocking and surreal, actually. And for years, we sort of believed that the tech right that comes out of California was mostly left-leaning liberals. But in the age of Trump, we're beginning to learn more and more about how these captains of industry, how these geniuses lean more and more to the right. And I'm thinking of people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and Robert Mercer as examples of brilliant tech entrepreneurs who have embraced Donald Trump and have been hostile to the idea of diversity. And there has always been a plan in America to try and weed out less desirable within America, to elevate the more desirable. The former president and right-wing Republicans have insisted that we use, for instance, merit as a way to determine who comes into this country. And intelligence, particularly in the age of computer science and technology, is seen as one of the most valuable commodities. So being a good person, a moral person, a hard worker is secondary to IQ. I want to begin with this clip. Again, it briefly discusses the phenomena on the right, what is called IQ fetishism. And it sort of gives us a good introduction as to what this concept is, where it comes from, and all that kind of stuff. So let me introduce you.
And you have this term IQ fetishism to talk about this idea of IQ and sorting people into these sort of cognitive stratospheres. Where do you see that debate really start to come back to prominence? So that the Michael Young book, I think, is in the 1950s. Where do you trace then the resurgence of these ideas more recently?
Well, I mean, I think it's worth very briefly sort of remembering where the IQ thing came from. Originally, it was the IQ tests were introduced to sort of select an officer class and delegitimize people who were entering the armed forces who might not be able to reason well enough to be incorporated into more like high responsibility positions. So it was originally intended to kind of do that sorting in terms of a military that was going to be fighting in the First World War in this case. It comes back in the 1950s and 60s, as you say, kind of as part of the shift to what was then for the first time being called a knowledge economy. So if you think about people not as primarily going into the mines or the factories or the battlefield, but doing things like white collar work, teaching, becoming lawyers, becoming stock traders, and so on, this was a kind of a new mandate for education. We're educating and finding talented people who can do these kind of mental tasks rather than physical tasks. So in the 60s, it really became a debate, especially in the UK, around streaming and whether or not you should create a universal education system, and that the old model of sort of public schools was actually suppressing merit and keeping people who could be more talented out of the kind of ruling or governing class. So in the UK, that's really where the debate picks up in the 60s. In the US, it's around, somewhat dormant, but really takes off in the 1990s. And the signature sort of extraordinary flag post there is the publication of this book called The Bell Curve by Charles Murray, who is a kind of libertarian think tanker, and Richard J. Hertenstein, who is a Harvard psychologist. They write this sort of 800-page, dense social science treaty, and it becomes a bestseller. It sells 400,000 copies. It's on the New York Times bestseller list for months and months and months. And it reopens this debate about IQ, specifically around the question of race and whether or not there are group differences in IQ, whether or not it's the case that groups defined as racial are somehow also defined by a kind of average, lower or higher level of IQ. And most importantly, whether or not the kind of 1960s ideology of racial liberation and egalitarianism had kind of skewed the outcomes such that more talented people from high IQ racial groups in their mind, things the whites, East Asians, Ashkenazi Jews, were being sort of kept out of power, kept out of meritocratic uplift in favor of lower IQ groups such as African Americans and Latinos. So it was an explosive topic that was, extremely disputed by experts. The American Psychology Association published a huge refutation of the findings of the bell curve. But it opened a conversation that sort of hasn't gone away, and this new tech right that the piece is built around needs to be seen as part of the kind of ongoing furore that opened up in the mid-1990s.
I personally believe between the white nationalists and the folks from Silicon Valley that surround the former president, that this movement, what is called IQ fascism, is making its way to the highest levels of power in our country. Trump was supported by Peter Thiel and Robert Mercer, both brilliant and wealthy. And Mercer reportedly believes that racism is exaggerated and has reportedly said that African Americans were better before the civil rights movement. Jane Mayer did an excellent article, an excellent rundown of who that guy is. Another name that comes up in the New Statesman article is Harlan Crow. And Crow has been in the news recently because of his deep ties with Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. So it's not just the executive branch of our government, but also the judicial branch. In the next video, I want to go into, and I want to show how they go more into this whole idea and how this whole concept sort of weaves throughout the government and throughout the think tanks and the the captains of industry, I like to call them, throughout the U.S. and throughout Silicon Valley. I think it's extremely important to recognize how much this is making an impact on the country at large. So let me go into that.
One of the things that really struck me about reading this piece, and as you talked there about the bell curve, was how phenomenally popular that book was, and how these ideas that we might like to think about as being kind of really on the fringes, really sort of like extreme theories, were clearly palatable and interesting to a large audience. I mean, is that still part of the dynamic around IQ fetishism, discussions of intelligence, this idea that there is some sort of hereditary aspect of this
Oh,
of this
absolutely.
idea?
I mean, the IQ fetishism of the right wing of the kind of tech world in Silicon Valley would be almost to a person, and I almost said to a man, because we are talking about a conversation like really dominated almost exclusively by men for reasons that we maybe will talk about in a second, is that they would see intelligence as largely hereditary and genetically determined in a way that, as they understand it, the kind of quote unquote woke egalitarian ideology that we have as a legacy of the 1960s keeps on trying to suppress. So, well, their chief complaint is, I would say, and why it was so explosive in the 90s and still is, it's got two sides. On the one hand, there's a kind of pushback against what they see as government overreach. So there's a feeling that, especially affirmative action programs that try to, put people from underrepresented groups kind of at the head of the queue, or create quotas for minority or underrepresented groups, are skewing the kind of the quality of people in occupations and the people who are rising to the top of government and the corporate world. So there's a kind of anti-meritocratic, as they see it, thrust to the policies that came out of the 1960s. Second, because they, in many cases, feel like there are some people that, let's say, left-hand side of the bell curve of the IQ distribution, who are kind of not salvageable as productive members of society, and who indeed do need to be kind of like warehoused or incarcerated, that this is kind of another part of what they see as like left-wing progressive ideology is repressing. So the fact that there are incorrigible parts of the population, and they do just need to be like sequestered from the rest of the community. Thirdly, the question of immigration becomes really volatile here, because the argument, if you believe, as they do, that there are kind of group differences defined by racial groups in IQ, then if you're letting in people from groups that you understand to be low IQ, you see this as producing what they call a kind of downward pressure on overall intelligence, or what they call a dysgenic rather than eugenic tendency. If groups with overall lower IQs, they see it, are having more children and are coming into the country in larger numbers, then a lot of these people on the tech right see this as kind of a secular trend towards, dumbing down the United States, causing it to lose its edge economically, and causing a kind of a perverse outcome where state policies lead to kind of a worse population quality.
Let's be clear here. One of the things that's really important is to recognize how this is happening today. And when you look at what's happening with this guy, Tommy Tuberville, where he's not allowing promotions to go forward in the military because he wants to get rid of all of the so-called woke ideology. That's what he's talking about here. And the idea of promotions, if you were a black person, you didn't get promoted in certain industries, in the military and whatnot, and that's mentioned earlier, because they felt that racially you couldn't handle it. Like the reason why, and the excuse used as to why it is that there are not more women's promoted, for instance, in the military or in the police force, more blacks in the police force, more blacks promoted in the military, professors, etc. It was because for years it was thought that they genetically couldn't handle it. They weren't where they needed to be, and that it's being forced on us through affirmative action, through DEI. You hear that a lot now on the right. Again, Tommy Tuberville, but you could talk about any number of different governors. You could talk about Ron DeSantis pushing what he's pushing. It all goes back to this stuff. And the role of the bell curve here is important, and I'm so happy that the writer linked everything back to how popular that book was in the 1980s. I also love the fact that he links it to the ongoing attacks to affirmative action. There is an absolute link between the attacks on affirmative action and this belief in a racial hierarchy. And it's so important to recognize that this has a long-standing history on the right. This is something that lives on the right and has been a part of Republican politics for as long as I've been alive. And it has new life in the leader of the Republican Party today. Moving on to the next, and I think this is my final clip. I just wanted to bring this one up. It's also fascinating. Who are the players involved in this whole thing?
The interesting thing about the tech right, and here I would include Nick Bostrom, who was at Oxford, who was a central philosopher of the effective altruism movement, Dominic Cummings, former advisor to Boris Johnson, and Richard Hanania, who's become a kind of sensation in the United States for the revelations of him writing pseudonymous alternative right tracts.
These ideas and this revival of IQ fetishism is really dominated by men. And you talk in the article about specific individuals who are really playing an outsized role in funding and attempting to mainstream these ideas. I mean, who are the key figures to know about here and to really be focusing on?
Well, I mean, I think Charles Murray, who was the original co-author of that book, The Bell Curve, in the 90s, continues to be active and continues to write books that are published on trade presses about the science of race and gender. Gender because the sort of assumption of this group is that women have a lower average IQ as a group than men, which, just as the racial kind of results, helps to reinforce conservative and reactionary racial stereotypes. So this apparently scientific evidence is used to reinforce the idea that women's role is more private and reproductive rather than active and public. The funder who's worked closely with Charles Murray, who I think is a good name to know, is Harlan Crow, which is a name right out of a sort of Cormac McCarthy novel, who was the heir to one of the United States' biggest real estate fortunes. His father was Trammell Crow, who was actually interestingly involved in the early stages with the revitalization of Canary Wharf. In my book, he shows up in a different context, which is, talking about turning the Docklands into a financial center, as they end up doing. So Harlan Crow has been in the news recently also for giving all kinds of gifts and unreported vacations and perks to Clarence Thomas, one of the members of the American Supreme Court, and got his fingerprints in a lot of this stuff. So he's supported the creation of this new sort of startup private educational institution called the University of Austin that promotes its roots in what was called the intellectual dark web, a few years ago, and promotes the investigation of quote unquote forbidden knowledge, which often means looking at the scientific reality of race and gender difference.
So these are the new players, pouring tons of money, tons of resources, putting their ideas, pouring these, what we know are debunked ideas over intelligence and race and grouping and sorting of people. Those are the players that have now taken on the mantle of others. We know that, as indicated here, the bell curve has been around a long time, so has Charles Murray peddling this stuff. But we've got new faces now, and they go to the highest parts of the U.S. government. And now we know they have a course in the University of Austin in Texas. So they are trying to recruit more young people to this toxic ideology, which has been around for such a long time. But I'd feel remiss if I didn't take a moment to play a clip from Race, the Power of an Illusion, which is a documentary for about 20 years ago. And they, in the documentary, debunk this whole notion of genetics and race. And this is just a small clip talking just specifically about genetics. That is so important and so vital to this conversation right now. And it's a short clip. Actually, it's probably about 6 minutes long, as I'm seeing here. But it is important to remember that what's old is new again. We already know about genetics and race and blood, and it refutes what Donald Trump said at the beginning of this video. It refutes what these guys are peddling in the University of Austin, because it's been around a long time and it's been debunked by today's science. So here's a clip from Race, the Power of an Illusion.
The idea of race assumes that simple external differences, rooted in biology, are linked to other, more complex internal differences, like athletic ability, musical aptitude, intelligence. This belief is based on the idea that race is biologically real.
All of our genetics now is telling us that that's not the case. We can't find any genetic markers that are in everybody of a particular race and in nobody of some other race. We can't find any genetic markers that define race.
And actually, what we're going to generate are billions of copies of a little section of your genetic code. And we're going to look
These students are gathering for a DNA workshop led by Cold Spring Harbor Labs teacher Scott Bronson.
And pipette up 30 microliters, fill it to
Marcus, Gorgeous, Jackie, Noah, Hannah, Jamil, and their fellow students are about to explore the biology of human variation.
But there's another type of DNA. Does anybody know what that type of DNA is? Yeah.
Mitochondrial?
Mitochondrial DNA. Very good.
They will compare their skin colors.
They're like not human colors.
They will type their blood. And they will swab cells from inside their mouths to extract a small portion of their own DNA. Once the sample is ready, they will compare some of their genetic similarities and differences.
We're going to look at a very tiny section of this ring.
The students begin the workshop with the same assumptions most of us have.
As you begin to look at the data, you might want to keep in your mind who you think you might be most similar to and who you think you might be most different to.
I think I probably have the most similarities with Mr. Bronson or with Carol, because we were white males, both Carol and I, and both Scott Bronson and I.
I think I'd have the most differences with Carol and the most similarities with Gorgeous.
She's African-American, I'm African-American. I mean, like, black.
I think maybe me and Natalia are most alike.
She's Latin American and I'm Latin American. I figured that there would be tons of differences, especially with people who looked so different.
Type 2.
To understand why the idea of race is a biological myth requires a major paradigm shift. An absolute paradigm shift, a shift in perspective. And for me, it's like seeing, what it must have been like to understand that the world isn't flat. For race to be more than skin deep, one has to have concordance. In other words, skin color needs to reflect things that are deeper in the body, under the skin. But most of human variation is non-concordant. Skin color or eye color or hair color is not correlated with height or weight. And they're definitely not correlated with more complex traits like intelligence or athletic performance.
Wait, who was the person you said was going to be most similar? Jamil, right?
Yeah. What's his number?
He's 34.
The tools of modern genetics allow the students to explore the idea of race and concordance. From the beginning, they believed they would be most similar genetically to those whose racial ancestry they believed they shared.
Okay. Who would you say was going to be most different?
No, but he's 9.
They have now sequenced a small loop of their mitochondrial DNA.
Wow.
Seems like everyone has blood.
The student's mtDNA appears as the letters A, C, T, and G, representing the 4 nucleotides that define our DNA. The students are sampling a small sequence, about 350 letters long. They find that most of it is identical, one to the other. What is not is highlighted in yellow.
9, 12. Jeez.
12.
A lot of differences with everybody.
Because I'm different. I'm really different.
Jamil thought he'd have the fewest mtDNA differences with Gorgeous.
But I was more like Kirill than I was than Gorgeous. She has like 12 differences, and like Kirill is like a white. His background. Yeah, he's like from Russia, and like we seem completely different, but it's less differences.
But I mean, it's hard to tell because we don't. I mean,
John thought he'd have the fewest differences with Kirill and with Noah. In fact, John discovered that he had the same number of differences with Kirill as he had with Jackie. Only 3.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
That's not bad.
I don't think mine is going to show up close with anybody.
If human variation were to map along racial lines, people in one so-called race would be more similar to each other than to those in another so-called race. That's not what the students found in their mtDNA.
So you would think that these guys who are so smart would already know this stuff, that they would have already figured this out since this data is already out there. So there's something else going on here. There's some reason why they're denying this information. Again, you can tell from the computers how old this video is. We're talking 20 years ago, maybe 23 years ago. But the race, the power of an illusion, and the history of America trying to sort people and how these ideas are not new. They're very old. That's what I hope I've been able to get across in this video. They've been around in America and on the right for generations. So look out for it. If you would like to leave a comment below, I will stream the entire series on Stream Me. That is stream.vtip.me. Again, if you want to, because I have the Race to Power of an Illusion video. If you would like me to stream it, leave a comment below and I will make it available at Stream Me. That is stream.vtip.me, and I will run, it's 3 videos and I think they're each about an hour long, and I will run that video on Stream Me. You can comment, you can reach me at mastodon.me Mastodon me, which is mastodon.vtip.me /@Eric. And you can ask me any questions or ask me to give more information or more links to other videos or whatnot on this subject, and I will. But the purpose of this video is to make you aware of what's going on. And yes, I know there's a war in Israel right now, and I know that the House of Representatives is in disarray, but we have to recognize we're in a war of ideas between the American right and everybody else. What's old is new again. Maybe the previous thoughts on race we totally forgot, but it's important that we remember it at this time, because these viewpoints of white supremacy, eugenics, all of these ideas that were in the dustbin of history that used to be on the dark web have come back, And they were disproven in the past, they were debunked in the past, but they've returned, and more importantly, they've returned to the highest levels of our government. They no longer exist on the fringes of the right, but they are now in every branch of government, and they now have their advocates in Silicon Valley with billions of dollars. They have their allies, and they have those billions behind them. And more importantly and frighteningly, they now have a university. So people need to be aware of what they're seeing and what they're hearing, and recognize that this is not new. This is very old. So I want to thank you very much for joining me on this video. But anyway, you can support this video and others like it at our PayPal, or you can just give it a thumbs up and like the video. If you want to reach out to me, as I said, Mastodon is the way to go. Until the next one, I hope you have the great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.